All right, we are now live for the AMA for September 2020. Hard to believe that we're here in September already, but there it is. So it looks like I've got a lot of questions already lined up, so I'll just jump right into them. I will say, however, keep in mind that if you're asking questions that people have asked many, many times before, like, what do you think about Jordan Peterson or Zizek? Probably going to skip over those because I've sort of done those to death. All right. John says he's got a question about Martin Luther, somebody who I haven't read for years, quite frankly. How do you construe the Martin Luther quote about sinning boldly? Is he saying that justice is of no importance of all in this world? Well, I can't actually answer that, at least. I'm just moving some papers here. He's not saying sin boldly all the time. He's saying that that's what you do when the chips are down and you've gone through everything else. Justice is obviously important in the world, as are other things that would guide our actions or our beliefs or behavior or stuff like that. So, that's probably enough about that. I mean, you could make a broader statement about moral theories in general, that a lot of times the catchphrases that people associate with them, they're part of a much, much larger system. And so they have more meaning within that system and applicability. All right. JD Sword asks if I've read Philodemus's On Anger. Yes, indeed I have. As a matter of fact, I referenced that back when I was still in New York, and I was doing my series on anger called Understanding Anger. There's a whole playlist of those. And I talked about the Epicureans, and obviously Epicurus, I mean, he might have said a lot, but we have very few of his texts, unfortunately. So we don't really know everything that, Epicurus himself had to say, let alone guys like Methodorus, who would be kind of cool to have as well. So we're in large respect rely on Philodemus's On Anger, which unfortunately is one of those texts from Herculaneum. It's one that got unrolled and a bit damaged, so we don't have the full text. We do have some other things that are useful from Philodemus, where he's talking about anger, like his discussion of frank speaking, parrhesia in Greek, where he talks about whether you should talk harshly to students or not, So yeah, I've read. It's quite interesting. He makes a distinction between natural anger and then anger that's motivated by what the Epicureans called vain desires and pleasures, kenos, empty. So a lot of the things people do get worked up about and upset about, not really worth getting that upset about it. Jonathan, a question that's been on my mind for a long time is, how might you reconcile the Stoic concept of logos with a Heideggerian ontology? I don't think you would. I don't think you'd reconcile anybody with a Heideggerian ontology, because Heidegger is very clear that everybody else's ontologies prior to him are misunderstandings of the question of being. So you're not going to reconcile those together. That's sort of like saying, how can you put a log into the fire and reconcile the log and the fire? Well, either the fire is going to go out or the log is going to get burnt up. So you're not going to reconcile them in the sense of having some sort of, fusion of them. Could you bring in some Heideggerian insights into Stoicism? Yeah, possibly. They're probably going to be at significant odds over, the theory of emotion and Heidegger calls moods, so you're not going to get a lot of traction there. But you may find some things where you can have at least some bringing things together. But reconciliation is just not going to be, unless you mean something very different by reconciliation, that's not really going to be possible. Joshua, do you happen to have any book recommendations for someone interested in learning about critical race theory? Well, I mean, Charles Mills, the Racial Contract is a great place to start. reading Martin Luther King, besides reading the I Have a Dream speech, which everybody brings up, but only actually reads a little bit of, and actually reading the letter from a Birmingham jail, there's already an important analysis about how racism works and how it's against the natural law in there. There's so many other texts that you could go through. So I'm not sort of an expert on that area. Maybe somebody else would chime in about that. But yeah, I mean, it's important to like read back. I would say the whole discipline of what we call African American philosophy is something that we'd want to look at. So you'd actually read Frederick Douglass, and when I say read, I mean, don't just read a piece by these people as representative, read into their corpus. Martin Luther King, for example, the more you read of him, the more you realize that he's not this sanitized version of let's be nice to each other that so many people today would like him to be, which was, very different than what he was being portrayed as in the past. And that his analyses of what was going on were actually quite deep. So I would say reading deeply is the key there. A says, which country do you think is the best politically, and which one do you think could realistically serve as a model for the U.S., assuming you're dissatisfied with the current state of affairs in the U.S.? I don't see why anyone wouldn't be dissatisfied with the current state of affairs in the U.S., given what a shambles it is and what a mess it's been for years and years and years, I mean, I don't think that you can actually get I don't think you can get Americans to look at other countries as really being a satisfactory model. I would hope that, we could, instead of like talking about individual countries, we could talk about the fact that, for example, most developed countries have good working systems of public health care that may have some problems with them. You might not get every drug you want. There might be rationing, but they're sure as hell better than what we've got here, except for the rich or the very lucky. So in that case, you wouldn't be comparing directly country to country. You'd say, listen, it's sort of like talking to like your idiot friend who doesn't think that they should wear pants in the winter. And you're like, listen, everybody else on the block is wearing pants. Not only are they helpful for keeping, the snow out of your crotch, but, they look nice and you can put things in the pockets. Don't you see how all these other people, and, your idiot friend could be like, I'm liberty. I'm going to do what I want to do. And you could be like, well, you're an idiot. At some point you have to do that. And there's a lot of things where we could change for the better by emulating other countries. It's going to be very challenging to do so because many of the things where we need changes, for example, in education, healthcare, policing, these things are handled so much at local levels, and the local levels have too much autonomy. And the processes are incredibly politicized when it comes to any sort of issue like that. And we have a dysfunctional political system, deeply dysfunctional. So I don't know that we can do that. Which country do I think is the best politically? I mean, I wouldn't be able to say. I could say that there are countries where the social systems seem to work better and where there's less of this, let's burn it all down if we don't get our way sort of bullshit going on, where there's some understanding that we do have to all live together and we have to start working on and solving our problems. We can say that there's political systems that work better than ours. Our electoral college thing is a crazy mess that we'll never be able to get rid of, because to get rid of it would require constitutional change. And we can't do that when Democrats and Republicans basically can't even sit in the same place without hating each other. So I don't see much progress happening there. All right, I'm going to take one question by Kierkegaardian Dude. And I'm going to try to take, generally just one particular question by a person and then move on to people who haven't had a question answered. So I'm not really interested in the general Kierkegaard critique of Hegel. That's a little bit too sweeping. Do I think Nietzsche is the most important philosopher to read when it comes to understanding the dilemma of contemporary meta-ethics? So I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here. Meta-ethics is bullshit. It's a discipline that was invented and people get a lot of mileage out of it, but it's not really a separate field from normative moral theories. Every time that you look at a real normative moral theory, and you do more than read the Wikipedia article on it or go beyond just a textbook version of it, like say Aristotelian virtue ethics, a tradition that goes all the way down to the present with proponents like Alistair McIntyre, they are already encompassing meta-ethics, because meta-ethics, doesn't just, have to do with like the things that we place under the Wikipedia entry. It has to do with how do you understand your moral theory in relation to other moral theories? How do you sort of frame moral development and all of that sort of stuff? And every main moral theory has a meta-ethics. So the field of meta-ethics, I think, is kind of BS. Every one of the things that we talk about as being meta-ethics, like, emotivism. Emotivism is also a moral theory. I mean, when you read the classic literature of it, like Stevenson, for example, it's clear as a bell. He comes out and tells you that. So there's that issue, right? Meta-ethics and normative ethics, not really separate from each other. People just like to pretend that they are because they get something out of that when they really interfuse with each other. Is Nietzsche the most important person to read? No, I wouldn't say so. I'd say he's an important person to read. But he doesn't have the answers to everything. I think all of you know I'm a pluralist, so I don't have anyone who I see as like the single philosopher to go to for stuff. So, all right. Mike Finney, what do you think about shunning authors' books after finding out they were or are pretty horrible, like some old sci-fi authors were racist, or J.K. Rowling with her comments about trans people? Well, to begin with, I think those two separate things, right? So I wouldn't lump those together under the same thing. If we're talking about, like old sci-fi authors who are racist, like, not a sci-fi author as such, but I guess you could call him such, like Lovecraft, horror author, weird tales author. You've got a couple choices there. You could say, well, we're not going to read him because he was a racist and I don't want to read those things. And there you've got to talk about a difference, right? You can say, I'm not going to read him, but I'm not going to like compel anybody else not to read him. And that's perfectly fine. You can not read anybody that you like. I'm not reading like a million different authors right now as I'm talking to you. And nobody gives a damn about that, right? Because I'm not going out there and saying, I'm not going to read H.P. Lovecraft, or whoever. When you try to make it a thing like, let's ban H.P. Lovecraft's books, which I don't see anybody doing. I do see some people saying, oh, you shouldn't reference him or read him. That's when we get into the territory where you can say, I don't know, there could be, I would say there's valuable circumstances under which you would read that. For example, if you're actually going to do critique of it, you have to read it and reference it, right? You can't just like push it to the side. But you might also say, well, there's ways in which we can look at the racism and say that I'm not going to let that bother me, or it's not really that essential to the story. I mean, as somebody of on my mother's side, French Canadian descent, Lovecraft would be somebody who, thought of my race as being a bunch of degenerates, right? They were moving down into New England from Quebec, and he didn't like that, right? Any more than he liked the Portuguese being there, or the Italians, or not to mention other worse races, right? You have a choice about that. J.K. Rowling's present day, right? I don't think we would say that, J.K. Rowling's is totally unaware of what's going on in the way that Lovecraft might have been about issues of gender and sexuality. So she's probably got a higher burden. We can also add the fact that her books suck. I've read the first Harry Potter book, and I was like, I was like, well, what is everybody getting out of this? And I was like, man, I see why people like glom onto this, but it's not very good compared to other fantasy authors that were around at the time. I mean, compare her stuff to Ursula K. Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea stuff. No comparison, And so, I don't think that we have to worry too much about J.K. Rowling. She's doing quite fine. She's got lots of sales. She should be set for life. So if people want to not read her books, I would say don't read them because they're not particularly good stuff. But let's say her books actually were really good. and she wanted to make, remarks about trans people, that might turn people off, and I think that's fine. I think, why are we so upset about people saying, I prefer not to read this? It's only when people are like organizing and saying, let's burn the books, ban the books, boycott the publisher, don't read anybody else's books coming from that publisher, where I think we have problems. And we have to make distinctions about this. This whole cancel culture thing, it's like a huge stamp, and it means all these different things to different people. We got to be careful in the way that we're thinking about these things. All right. Let's see what else we got here. Just skipped a little bit. Chris, any advice on bringing up philosophical concepts in conversation without making it sound like philosophy? Okay, so I actually do this when I do like workshops with business people. I present them with ideas, and I tell them that, these are ideas that actually work, and, they can learn more about it if they want to. They don't know that the ideas are coming from Aristotle or the Stoics or Thomas Aquinas or things like that. If they ask me afterwards, I'll let them know, and I'll say, well, this idea about anger is dealing with the difficult good that I've been talking about for the last hour. That came from Thomas Aquinas. You might check him out. That's one way to do it, I think, is conceal the fact that it's actually philosophy. What other ways could you do it? That's really the big one. You could talk about like the historical period that they're involved in, and then name drop them into it. I don't really know much beyond that. Most of the people that I'll say too, most of the people that I'm interacting with these days, either they're like people who don't care at all about philosophy because they're like my family and some of my friends, and we just want to hang out and sort of like turn our brains off for a bit and do other things and talk about like, who's now pregnant and who had a kid and, who's going to school where and, who got sick and stuff like that, or reminisce about the old days. Or I'm being brought in to talk about philosophy. So I'm actually not a really good person to talk about that, because a lot of people who are engaging with me do want to talk about philosophy, right? All right, Lyle himself, why is the American mainstream left so out of touch with the masses? I don't think that it is. I think that's kind of a talking point that people on the right have. I see no evidence that people on the mainstream left are out of touch with the masses any more than people on the mainstream right are. It depends on which person you're talking about. People who are in the political class and are making tons of money, like Barack Obama or Nancy Pelosi, who are pretty center left. They're not radically left. They're out of touch, but they're out of touch not by being leftists. They're out of touch by being rich and powerful, just like people who are on the right are out of touch by being rich and powerful. You leave behind your humble beginnings as you make compromise after compromise after compromise. That's not a left dynamic. That's a rich person dynamic. There's plenty of other people on the left who aren't out of touch with that. I know plenty of them. So that's it's sort of a non-starter premise to ask about. All right. Vishnu asks, hi, how are you? Very nice to ask. I am very busy. I am teaching 6 classes this semester, and there's a long story about how I wound up doing 6 when I really only meant to do 4. But I'm committed to it, so that means that I'm shooting videos. I actually just shot 3 videos this morning for my biomedical ethics class at Carthage College that I'm teaching, which I was asked to teach starting, in July. They contacted me and they're like, hey, can you do this? And I maybe foolishly committed to doing it. So I'm pretty busy. I still have my usual clients and consulting work that I'm doing, and I've even picked up a few new clients as well. We're gearing up for StoicCon, for which I'm going to be a backup speaker, Stoic Week and StoicCon X's. As editor of Stoicism Today, I have to, be involved in the promoting and stuff like that. So lot of work going on. My daughter just moved up to attend school here at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So we're trying to find time to actually spend time together, socially distanced. We've been able to meet up once. My wife is just as busy as I am. She's working downstairs right now. So we're both super, super busy and trying to live a life together. And do a few fun things on the side every once in a while. Go take a walk together, or have like the heavy metal philosophy, the classic heavy metal class, or things along those lines. But yeah, I am really busy, probably in better health than I've been in years, in part because of all those masked up walks, which is a good thing. Eating well, and so that's what's going on. Bindi Bushpig, my supervisor said rationalists were fundamentally atheists, but I always view them as theists, though that's a large group. It is a large group. So who are we talking about as rationalists? If we mean the continental rationalists, Descartes was a theist. You can't, Cartesian philosophy, there are arguments for the existence of God. Now you could say, like Pascal does, that Descartes brings in God to get his philosophy off the ground and then doesn't have any use for him. And we know that Descartes was not a particularly committed religious believer, but God still plays a central role. Spinoza is a rationalist. God is substance. Leibniz is a rationalist. So maybe your supervisor means rationalist in a different sense, because if he's talking about historically the people that we call philosophical rationalists, very clearly some of them are theists. They may be more deistic than other, sort of more robust theists, you could say, but they are definitely theists. If we're talking about in, say, the 20th century, and we're talking about rationalism in French circles, then yeah, they would typically be atheists, although they often, like Leon Brunswick, believed in some sort of conception of spirit that's rather a lot like Feuerbach's conception in his discussions about Christianity, that it's really the religious community of humanity. So it depends on which rationalist you're talking about. Nicholas, are there theories of natural philosophy that are neither Aristotelian Thomist teleology and Nietzschean perspectivism? I'm interested in its reference ethics. Yeah, there's tons. I mean, we're just talking about rationalists. Descartes has a philosophy of nature. There's all sorts of philosophies of nature out there that aren't either Aristotelian or Nietzschean. I guess maybe you're taking this from McIntyre, from sort of a thing coming from after virtue. He's not really talking there about theories of natural philosophy. He's talking more about moral philosophy than natural philosophy, where it's like Aristotle or Nietzsche. But yeah, there's lots of different perspectives in natural philosophy out there. Tea or coffee from David? Coffee. I drink coffee from the morning until usually about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then if I'm going to drink anything, I switch to oolong tea after that. I have a massive thing of Iron Goddess of Mercy that we bought about a year ago, and I'm working my way through. And then we get our coffee from Stone Creek, which is a local roaster that does a lot of really great work, both with their supply chain. They do sustainable practices. They're an ethical company, and they're pretty good. Although there's some complaints among workers, obviously, but they're probably one of the best places to be a barista around. They offer all sorts of cool classes when we're not in COVID times. So yeah, this is Stone Creek Coffee, and putting in a little plug for them. All right. Useless projects. Is Meursault from Albert Camus' The Stranger the absurd hero the whole way through the book, or just at the end? No, there is no the absurd hero. There are absurd heroes. If you read the myth of Sisyphus, there are many different ways to live out an absurd life. And Meursault is just one of them, and actually not the best one. Camus, in one interview, actually calls him kind of a bastard. He's not endorsing Meursault as the proper response to the absurd. As a matter of fact, there's some things kind of wrong with Meursault, right? You look at his indifference to the suffering of others. And then you read Camus himself, very attuned to those sorts of things. So, what I would do is I would, read The Stranger, obviously, but also read books like The Plague and look at some of the other characters, and then read the Myth of Sisyphus and that section about, an ethics of quantity and these different things. Don Juan could be an absurd hero, for example. Sonny Jim, for a newcomer to Nietzsche, in what order do you read his works? Any order you want. They don't have to be read in a particular order. I suppose you could say you should start with The Birth of Tragedy, because it's an early work, and it really is a good work that you shouldn't avoid. Nietzsche says some bad things about it later on, but you got to take that with a grain of salt. It really is a work worth reading, but there is no order in which you have to read Nietzsche's works. As a matter of fact, with most philosophers, there isn't an order in which you have to read their works. You can pick and choose. It's up to you. You're going to reread the stuff anyway. After you've read some stuff. It's sort of like with the Platonic dialogues. Which one do you have to start with? Start by reading something, and then expect to reread later on. Obviously, with the Platonic dialogues, maybe don't start with the Republic or the Laws, because those are giant texts, and there's so much going on there. But I start, when I have students read Nietzsche, I start sometimes with Genealogy of Morals. Sometimes I have them start with Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Sometimes I have Beyond Good and Evil. I've used Truth and Lies in an Extra Moral Sense as a starting text. They're all just fine places to go. Just don't expect to understand everything that you read right away. And, you're going to see references back and forth within his text, same concepts coming up over and over again. Housekeeping. Do you like the ancient historians like Plutarch, Herodotus, etc.? Which one would you recommend to start with? Yeah, I like reading them. I like reading history. Plutarch is way more than history. He's of importance to me more for his Moralia, the moral works that he wrote as a representative of Middle Platonism, than he is for his historical works, because I'm a philosopher. And I'm more interested in the ethical stuff that he's putting forth. But the historical stuff is fun to read. I mean, you could start with Herodotus. Why not? You could start with Thucydides if you want to. There's no set order in which you have to read them. You're not going to damage your brain by reading the first one. Reading this one first and then going on to another one. It's the same with philosophy, right? You don't have to start with Plato. It's just, can be awfully convenient to do that, right? You could start by reading Augustine, reading the Confessions if you want to. There's no absolute rule about these sorts of things. Mina says, what are the Western canon of literature? What's the best way to study it? That you want to Google, right? Because the Western canon of literature is this vast set of books. I'm not going to try to list them off here. There's disagreement about which ones should be in there. What's the best way to study it? There is no best way to study it. Different books require different approaches. So reading, for example, Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy is going to require some of the same, but also some different approaches than even just reading Augustine's Confessions, as I mentioned, right? They're both ones that are semi-biographical, but there's a lot of philosophical stuff in there, but yet there's also, differences between them. So there isn't any, there's a lot of, I'll say this, I'm going to do another little rant. There's a lot of people out there selling systems and approaches for the great books. They're all full of crap. I don't mean totally full of crap, because, I'm sure you can learn something from them, but there isn't one single approach that works for everybody. There's no system or order that you have to read them in. Those are for suckers, for people who want somebody else to tell them what to do, and they think that, this person is going to provide them with absolute guidance. That's not a good way to read literature. You actually have to have some, independence and some self-motivation, and you have to be willing to plug away at these texts that are often not going to reward you on the first reading. And the people who have a set, order or something, they're selling something to you. They're not really looking out for your best interest. They may think that they are, because they've deluded themselves into this is the only right approach. A lot of these great books programs I'm really skeptical of them. And I've become more and more, the older I've gotten and the more that I've interacted with people that are the products of them, who have these vast gaps in their knowledge base, you know? So anyway, that's my little rant. Let me go on to the next one. Bradford, can you comment on the professor put on leave because of a misunderstanding while giving class? Why do you think the school went so far and didn't take into consideration all aspects? Because people make decisions. I mean, you're asking me about some case that I don't really know more than you do about it. I don't know how they arrived at the decision that they made. If you've ever been inside the academy, you realize that it's not, it's never a place of like absolute fairness and justice and due process. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes that doesn't. Sometimes people react to political pressure. Sometimes they don't. I don't know. I wouldn't blow it up into a case that's like representative of everything that's happening in our society. I would treat it as the case that it is and see if you find other cases that are similar. If you find enough that there's a pattern, then it's really an issue. If not, it's just some unfortunate misunderstanding that may be worked out legally, for all we know. The personal, the person's not going to be doing terrible. I'm sure they're going to be on right-wing talk shows and make plenty of money doing interviews and stuff like that. So things like that will happen. When I taught for the first time, I was in a intro to philosophy class, and I was a TA, and my mentor, Garth Gillen, he wanted each of us to lecture twice during the semester. And he would observe the lecture and give us notes, and that would be helpful for us in our development. And this was like preparatory to like having your own class later on. So I get up there and I gave a lecture, and Garth was somebody who did Holocaust studies. So there was this piece that he assigned for the day, and it was about like what was going on and the humiliation of people and how it was a deliberate thing to do. And I gave this lecture, and this woman came up to me afterwards. She was an undergraduate, and she's like, "Why did you say that, the Jews hate God?" And I was like, "What? I didn't say anything remotely like that." And I made the mistake of like having this sort of, where are you getting this from? Kind of, in your face sort of thing with her. But and I was in the right, because she clearly misunderstood what was being said, and she hadn't done the reading and all that. And then she went and complained to the chair, and the chair brought me into his office, and he's like, "What's going on here with this?" And I was like, "I don't know. This lady's kind of nuts, and she's saying these things. I didn't say anything remotely like this in the lecture. I clarified that for her afterwards, and clearly she didn't do the reading." And he's like, "Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. You got to learn how to deal with cases like this, where students are going to not pay attention, and they're going to react more on the basis of what's in their minds and weighing on them than anything to do with you. So don't take these things personally. Don't get angry at them for doing that sort of thing. Just like adjust and say, here's what actually happened." And sometimes a lot of cases, that'll actually deal with the problem. Some cases it won't. And then maybe you've got a kind of toxic environment that you have to figure out what you're going to do about. So, all right. Bradley, I'm lazy. What is the or your source of ambition and motivation? Well, I mean, I'm lazy sometimes too. I set goals and to-do lists for myself, and I don't get everything done. A lot of what I do is because I've made commitments to do it. So I've got these 6 classes I'm teaching this semester. Some of them I could just basically take the materials that I already had for previous classes, recycle them, but I still have to log in, engage with the students, do the grading, all that sort of stuff. Some classes like biomedical ethics, I'm developing all new materials for that, and that's a bit more work. Or world religions, I'm developing new materials. I used to teach it as a staple class, but that was before I became involved with electronic education and the video, so I don't have a whole stock of videos to use. So commitments to others and following through on those commitments is a big part of what I do. And then I would say that some of it is kind of like, you establish habits, and those kind of see you through after a while. I'm largely making it on the basis of inertia. Like every day I get up and I'm like, all right, what do I got to do? I check my calendar. I sometimes rearrange things, and I start plowing through the stuff, and I take breaks from time to time. One of my little luxuries is getting to take long hot baths and getting to read in the bath while I do that, or sometimes just zone out, or sometimes go on Twitter and see what's going on. And that self-care helps out. Exercise can be very helpful if you're not exercising. It gets the circulatory system going, gets more, blood and oxygen in your brain, makes you feel a bit better. If you're feeling lazy and you make yourself exercise, you at least got something done that can help out as well. Here's a good question from Compar82. Is our only hope alien invasion or AI takeover? If those are our only hopes, we're really screwed. Because what's to say that the aliens wouldn't just look at it as resources to be exploited, right? Or the AI, we could wind up in a Matrix sort of thing. So I don't think so. I mean, I think things are on a rough trajectory as far as the environmental degradation to the planet and issues of justice and how we're dealing with things politically. I don't know that the arc of history actually tends towards, justice or anything like that. I'm enough of a historian to say that's not really the case. But there's always hope, and we shouldn't denigrate the good that is here for us to enjoy and produce and realize in the present. Helping out my daughter with lining up her studies and not being as anxious about it as the typical freshman, that doesn't change the world situation, but that is some good that a person can do in this life. And it's not valueless because maybe everything will go to hell in 70 years. It still has value. And so I don't think we have to be hopeless. All right, Bastian, what is your take on Diotima's role in Plato's Symposium and Plato's decision of teaching love through the mouth of a woman? It's not just teaching love, it's teaching metaphysics, it's teaching all sorts of stuff, right? There might have actually been a real woman Diotima. We don't really know about this. And again, this is one of those things. Anybody who says that like there definitely was no Diotima, or we definitely know that there was a Diotima, or Diotima is definitely just a stand-in for Aspasia, who the consort of Pericles, who might have taught Socrates. They don't know. We don't know historically. Plato's decision to place it in the mouth of a woman. I mean, Plato says that women and men have the same capacities. It's right there in the Republic, right? So Plato's a feminist in the sense of being an equality feminist, thinking that you judge people not on the what's between their legs, but what they do in their life and what's in their minds. It may be a reflection of some actual historical thing. It may be a way of getting around, the fact that all the women have been dismissed. You notice that she talks about man and man, right? So I don't really know. What I do know is that it's significant that there's this narrative shift. Nowhere Man, Nietzsche's perspectivism. How does he objectively state the existence of order and rank and emphasis that philosopher is not born and made, preordained meaning, contrast existentialism? I don't really know exactly what you're saying there because that's kind of a word salad. So I'm just going to pass on that one. All right. Thomas Watson, I'm still only 17 and still not very well read. What philosophers would you recommend for a beginner? Bataille is one of the most intriguing I've come across so far. Yeah, Bataille is an intriguing guy. This stuff is pretty weird and wild, right? And it's a lot of fun. I don't know that I would. There's nothing wrong with reading him, but I don't know that I would like have him early on in my studies. Then again, I got into philosophy not reading things in the right way myself, and things have turned out okay. At 17, you probably shouldn't be particularly well read. As a matter of fact, you're probably not going to be so even at 25. There's a lot of stuff out there to read, and you're going to keep going at it. I can't even say that I'm particularly well read. When I was in graduate school, one of the backhanded compliments that one of my friends gave, because there were people who'd read a lot more stuff than me, was, Greg hasn't read much, but he sure gets a lot of mileage out of the things that he's read, because I was an attentive reader. So, he was saying this guy doesn't read enough stuff. Now that changed as I got ready for my comps and prelims and stuff like that. But I wouldn't worry too much about not being well read. I would take this as a time to sort of stock up on things, read things that people say are good, and you don't have to read them in a particular order. You don't have to be worried about that. What you're reading for class, if you do go to college and major in philosophy or take philosophy classes, read that stuff, but then read other stuff too, because we never get to put all the books that we'd like into the syllabus, because we're stuck with this 15-week, which really often in some of the places I'm teaching, we really only get 12 effective weeks of teaching in. You always have to leave all this stuff out that you'd like to address. So you can read whatever you want to, yeah, I think it's probably enough there. All right, Lala says, happy weekend, everybody else here. Florga says, what do I think is the best way to teach philosophy to high school students without watering philosophical concepts down? You're always going to water them down. It's not a question of whether you water them down. It's a question of how you do it and whether you go too far with it. So it's okay not to expect the world of high school students. I mean, high school is a time where you're figuring out your body and where you fit into the social classes and hierarchy and dealing with all the bullshit rules that your school has for you. So I wouldn't put too much stress on high school students. If you can get across some concepts, and think about it this way: your goal is not to try to get as much crammed into their head, sort of like stuffing a suitcase. Like when you go on a trip and you want to take all these things along with you, stuffing that suitcase and then zipping it up so that when you get there, it pops open and everything's flying. It's not that. You want to make them into lifelong learners. So you want to, one part of this is affective. You want them to not necessarily fall in love with ideas, but at least see that there's something there that's valuable, that is worth going back to over and over again. And you also want to cue them into what the resources are out there that they can keep on using to, continually learn, to learn more and more and develop more and more as junior philosophers, right? So, these days, obviously, that includes the internet. So cueing them into places where they can get texts and read them for free. Good podcasts, good video series, useful websites, things like that. Make those part of your class resources. And then, teach them in class, but don't expect the world from them, I would say. All right. Chris says, can the Stoics teach us anything about our own times? Lots of stuff, For example, they can teach you that a lot of the things that people are worked up about are probably not worth being worked up about, and how to avoid getting, tangled up with, a lot of different movements and the rage that fuels them. They can tell you that when it comes to our political situation, justice ought to be really much more important than it is, and that we ought to take principled stands, that the dichotomy of control didn't keep Stoics from actually taking committed, sometimes for them, fateful stands on who should be in charge and how we should treat people. there's a lot of things for them to teach us. So yeah, and I know you can say the same thing about other forms of virtue ethics too, whether it's, Aristotelian or various Christian thinkers who also, by the way, use Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, or the Platonic tradition, which isn't just Plato, but also includes Plutarch and, the Neoplatonists. Yeah, they can all teach us things that are useful. Bradford Gurst, liberty versus equality, irreconcilable. When you put it in such an abstract way, I wouldn't even say you can say anything meaningful about that. You have to specify what you mean by liberty, and you have to specify what you mean by equality and where they conflict with each other. This sort of like slogan level stuff, it's not useful. Mr. Big Weekney, my professor told me Aquinas believed Christianity could provide insights that philosophy could not. What insights could he have had in mind? The doctrine of the atonement, for example, and the incarnation. There's all sorts of things. Philosophy, or rather theology, if you look at the Summa Theologia, right? Reason can provide the preambles of faith, but it can't provide everything of the faith. There's a role for things being revealed, although there's a lot. Aquinas thinks there's an awful lot we can figure out through using human reason. But it's usually in a sort of dynamic. Faith suggests something, reason takes it on, thinks about it, and then comes up with a viewpoint on it, right? Some insights about it. Moises, how much have you read about Marx's critique of German idealism, specifically Hegel? 49% of it. I don't know. I mean, I've read quite a bit of Marx over the course of my studies. I don't know exactly how much. I would say probably most of the stuff, if we're talking about the early philosophical and economic manuscripts. That probably answers the question. Housekeeping, what do I think of Erasmus? Erasmus is somebody who I remember enjoying reading. I haven't read him for so long that there's really not much to say. He's somebody I'd like to go back to if I ever do find the time. I recall there being stuff in there that was interesting, but I can't really remember what it was. So, Nick Wood, thanks for all your work. Well, you're very welcome. Glad to be doing it. Steve Lebowski, what do I usually eat for breakfast? Thanks for everything. So you could say there's four main kinds of breakfasts that I have. One is granola and half. We don't have milk. We have half and half. I've gotten used to using that because higher fat content, and there's some good granolas that we get. I am trying to do lower carb, but I really do love granola, so that's something. Smoothies are another thing I'll have for breakfast. Take one of those like protein drink things that we get from Costco, and then put in some fruit and some Greek yogurt, and sometimes things like flax seeds or some other high protein thing, hemp hearts, right? Blend it all up together, eat it. Then there's occasionally eggs and something else, right? It could be bacon, it could be sausage, it could be smoked salmon. Sometimes I make the eggs as omelets with, cheese and peppers. And if we have ham, I use ham or onions or things like that. Sometimes I just kind of blend it in there. Sometimes it's just eggs and cheese. Sometimes it's egg sandwiches. So a lot of egg things. And then very, very, very occasionally we'll have like a full brunch, but haven't done that for a long time. We haven't been out to eat anywhere since COVID. But every once in a while we'll do something like that. Oh, and sometimes we'll have pancakes too, or waffles. So, yeah. All right, Govind Kaushik. Have you read anything by Maurice Blanchot? What do you think of his works? I haven't read anything by him for over 2 decades. So people recommended me to read him because I was very interested in Derrida. I don't remember finding Blanchot all that insightful or interesting. So I just haven't done it afterwards. Neolib Shill, why is it so hard start reading into philosophy. I've picked up many books, including secondary lit, even with the most basic things. I can't understand anything and I get lost in the terms. I don't know. That is not the experience that I would say most people have had, but it does happen. Maybe you need to do it in smaller chunks and go back over it. Different people respond differently to philosophical literature. Some people get more out of it than others. Could help you to sort of map things out, make use of resources other than secondary lit. So that might help you out. All right. Lord Roku, I've been reading through a lot of Stoic literature. I've been asking myself how epistemology, logic, and physics tie in together into ethics. Could you perhaps explain that? So the Stoics didn't have the term epistemology. That actually fits into what they call logic, which has to do with processes of inference and particularly with what they call assent. So they have three main divisions of philosophy, and they weren't the only to do this, but they really made it a hallmark. There's ethics, which also includes some of what we would call philosophical psychology, particularly the theory of the emotions, although that also fits into physics. There's physics, which is about the natural world and how it works. The reason why I say that psychology would kind of fit into physics, if you think about Aristotle's On the Soul, that was considered a physical work. So the Stoics coming a little bit later, their stuff could fit in there as well. And then we have the logic, which is, not just about argument. It's about how we make inferences, what counts as good inferences. And the epistemology kind of figures into that. And they're three different disciplines, but obviously they're connected with each other. If you read Epictetus, there's a really funny section where he's talking about why the art of reasoning is important. He's talking about logic there. This is in book 1 of the Discourses. And he must have had a student who was like, I don't want to study this logic stuff. I just want to do the ethics. And he's like, fine, do whatever the hell you want. See how that works out for you. Just study the ethics stuff. And then when somebody trips you up with some sophistic argument, don't come crying to me. Go to the logic books and start studying them, you dummy. and Epictetus is very content to do this with a lot of things, to say, hey, man, you want to do the things your own different way because you think you're smarter than everybody else, you go right on ahead and see how it works out for you. So, the logic part helps us with the ethics in structuring our moral, and practical reasoning about things. And the physics thing helps to understand the nature of the universe. If you want to be living in accordance with nature, you have to have some conception of what nature looks like, right? Now, unfortunately, we've lost probably 90% of the classic Stoic literature. We look at the list of books in Diogenes Laertes, and we have almost just nothing from Zeno, nothing from Cleanthes, nothing from Chrysippus, nothing from Diogenes, nothing from these other authors. Just fragments here and there preserved in Galen or Plutarch or Cicero or people like that. So we don't know enough about. We know more about the ethics than we do about their logic or their physics, but we do know some of it. All right, Constantine, do you feel philosophy helping you in daily life? If so, should it be taught at school? Yeah, obviously, I feel philosophy helping me in my daily life. It provides me with a living, a source of income. That's kind of trivial, but yeah, it's helped me a lot, in a lot of ways. But I'm kind of a weird case, right? So to begin with, I'm somebody who's studying philosophy professionally for the last 30 years. So it could be something that has nothing to do with my life. Like I could be like, some analytic philosophers where they do their little thing and then there's the rest of their life over here. And I've always found people like that rather odd ducks. Because I got into philosophy in part because I wanted it to be practical and have something to say about life and how to live it. But, that makes me kind of in a minority. Would it be better to teach it in school? Yeah, it would be. But, the way our systems are set up, there's not a lot of room for that, unfortunately. They're pretty stuck, When we have trouble finding funding for physical education and music and art, it's going to be hard to produce an argument for philosophy classes. But we can try to do our best to smuggle it in, you know. Caesar Augustus, who is the most misrepresented or misquoted philosopher? I don't know how we would ever figure that out. I mean, we'd have to like have a way of like comparing the things that are said to what they actually did say. I guess I could just say there's a lot of people who do get misquoted. And we got to be kind of, you know, if you don't see where the quote is actually coming from, you should probably assume that it's bullshit, you know, especially if it's got a picture of the person, and especially if they get the picture wrong. Like if they're quoting Epictetus on some Stoic thing, like in the Stoic Facebook group, and it's a picture of Epicurus, you know this person is full of crap because they can't tell the difference between the two of them. And they're probably trying to sell you some coaching thing or some BS like that. All right. James, what do I think are reasonable critiques of Mill's harm principle and individualism more broadly? I mean, a lot of the criticisms of individualism are just not looking, you know, it's sort of a superficial treatment of things. Very often the individual is much more abstract, and they don't look at their relationships. People can be in sort of a privileged position to be individuals, and then they forget about everything they're getting from everybody else. Nobody's self-made. You know, the harm principle is the idea that we shouldn't forbid any actions. Usually, sometimes it's only governmental. Sometimes we think about larger social stuff. We shouldn't forbid actions that unless they harm other people. So if somebody's harming themselves and they're only harming themselves, we should let them do that. So if they want to, you know, if they want to smoke crack or shoot up heroin, according to the harm principle, understood in a certain way, then they're not really hurting anybody. Let them do it. Now, of course, you can say, well, yeah, but junkies steal stuff, you know, to feed their habit. Well, then they are hurting somebody else, right? So there's a lot of cases where the harm principle seems to apply, but doesn't really apply when we think out the consequences. A parent who's getting high and wasting their resources on that, you know, they're neglecting their children. They're neglecting certain duties, and so that would be a problem. All right. Govind, are you interested in Indian philosophy and works like the Upanishads or Nagarjuna's works? I am interested in it. I'm handicapped by the fact that I don't read, say, Sanskrit. If I want to go, you know, I have to trust other people's translations. And it's not an area of my specialization. I've read enough in Indian philosophy and also Chinese philosophy to know that these are vast cultural spheres as big as the West, and I will never in my lifetime be able to make enough progress in them to be really an expert. That said, you know, I'll teach some of that stuff to my students. I've taught non-Western philosophy in the past. I don't specialize in it, and I don't get the time to read as much as I would like. Life Circle, I'm reading Nietzsche, and I have a question. When he talks about men in some texts, is he talking about men or talking about the human being? You'd have to go to the text and see whether he's using Menschen, which is a generic term for a human being, which then gets translated as men typically, or whether he uses other terms. So it would depend on the particular instance. Lokesh, aren't democratic societies close to a collapse when our electoral politics is quite simplistic, considering how complex our societies are? I wouldn't say that. I would say they're close to collapse when the different sides no longer think that they can work with each other. And that we've had an erosion of, you could call it civil society in terms of our politics for the last 20 years. And both sides are equally responsible for that, although the conservatives right now are doing way more damage than the liberals are at this point in time in America. Part of why I'm against them, because I take my positions from a virtue ethics perspective, rather than from I'm a conservative or a liberal perspective. When we have the sort of factionalization and polarization that we have, we're in really dangerous waters. Aristotle would say that. You know, just read Politics book 5, and you'll see some problems. But having, you know, simple slogans and stuff like that to deal with complex issues, not that big of a deal, because when you actually get in office, then you're like, holy crap, these are complex issues. We better bring some experts in, and we better start, doing some structuring. So that's not that big of a deal. All right, Damon says, happy Derby Day. Aristotle taught me how to handicap horse races. I guess it must be Derby Day. I don't follow horses. The only sports that I really pay any attention to are NFL football and hockey occasionally. We have an AHL team here that we go and watch. And we'll also, I haven't done it for years and years, but we'll go and watch roller derby as well. But I don't know anything about horse races. Solid. Here's another one I'm going to have to punt on. How do you believe philosophy affects architecture? I don't know. That's way out of my wheel well. Matt Tucker, do you know any existentialist compatibilists, soft determinists? I mean, I agree that we are in a sense radically free, but I can't choose to break the laws of physics. It's not really about breaking laws of physics. Read Jean-Paul Sartre, Being and Nothingness. He's got a whole section devoted to this very problem of determinism and freedom. So he's an example. Nicola, can you explain Aristotle's knowledge and the types of knowledge? You could look in Nicomachean Ethics, book 6, and you'll find 5 types of knowing. I wouldn't call them knowledge because we usually translate episteme as knowledge. But then there's techne, craft, or art. There's phronesis, practical wisdom, Sophia, which is wisdom as such, nous, which it's hard to explain. It gets translated as intuition. These are all different modes of knowing things. But you want to go to Nicomachean Ethics, book 6. J.B. Bell, good to see you. Apologies if you answered this, but any good consoling works on forced solitude, speaking of social distancing? That's a good question. Forced solitude. You could read Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. He's under house arrest, and he's bemoaning how shitty the world is and how he's been mistreated, and he's kind of in solitude. And then Lady Philosophy comes and tells him, you're really being kind of a whiner. You're not living up to your principles. I don't know that would actually make you happier, but it'd certainly take your mind off of things for a little while. What else? Rilke talks about solitude. And, actually his advice to a young poet does discuss this guy. He's writing to this guy who's a military officer who wants to be a poet, and talking about the solitude that he's in, not because of forced social distancing, but because he's stationed way out in the middle of nowhere. That could be interesting. Nietzsche talks about solitude at different places, particularly in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Epictetus he's got a whole chapter on solitude, so that might be worth checking out. Epictetus is good because he says, what makes solitude or being alone bad for you? It's the feeling like you don't have resources to deal with the things that you have to deal with, which could be the very feeling of loneliness, right? So, yeah. All right. Let's scroll down again. Uriah, there's so much division in the world today. How can one develop a holistic understanding of the present political and cultural situation in order to develop a method for engaging with the world? I don't know that you need to do that to engage with the world. I think that you can look at issues that you want to focus on, and you don't have to come up with the theory of everything to be able to act appropriately. So yeah. All right. What do I think of the categories? If they're not apocryphal, I don't know anyone who thinks they're apocryphal, are about. As I'm sure you know, there's a scholarly debate whether it's ontological, logical, or linguistical. It's all three. There's an easy way to resolve it. Why do you have to make it logical or linguistical? Why can't you say, for Aristotle, the categories actually, are ways in which we talk about being? I'm more concerned with the fact that it's a tough text to start undergrad students out on. So, Andrew, after many years of philosophical study and teachings, do you have an idea or set of principles we could use for daily life? Yeah, I mean, I combine I combine a lot of different things together. I draw some from Stoicism and some from the Aristotelian approaches. I'm a big fan of Cicero. I'm sort of a Ciceronian eclectic. I mentioned the Platonic stuff. There's stuff from Christian thought that I draw in, existentialist thought, dialectical thought, and I, a lot of these things are sort of, well, this situation calls for this thing. I don't have like any of the really big, in every situation you must do this. It's a bit more contextual. Himanshu, should we read primary, secondary philosophical texts? I'll put it to you this way. If you're not reading primary philosophical texts, you might ask yourself, why the hell are you doing philosophy in the first place? Why would you, let's take Plato. Why would you ever deprive yourself of the opportunity to read these texts that we're so fortunate to still have, given how much ancient literature has been lost, and instead read so-and-so's take on Plato? Why would you want to do that? It's sort of like, if you can go to a concert and see Saxon, right, who are still touring, well, once COVID's over. I mean, Biff Byford has got to be almost 70, and they still rock, right? I've seen them on stage. Why wouldn't you go see Saxon instead of seeing some Saxon tribute band? Or listen to somebody doing a documentary on Saxon. Why wouldn't you actually do that? I mean, secondary literature can be helpful, but it's secondary literature, except for the really good secondary literature, which becomes a primary literature of its own. Like when you read Kojève's Introduction to the Reading of Hegel, that's secondary literature, but it's also Kojève, who's worth reading because he's interesting in his own sake. A guy who so strongly believed in this vision that he's getting from Hegel that it led to him being an EU bureaucrat. That's an interesting guy, right? Yeah, I mean, secondary literature is there to help you. That's the point of it, or to explore some interesting things coming from that. I mean, here's a great example. So here's one of my textbooks for my bioethics class, right? Basics of Bioethics. And it's not bad. It's not great. Textbooks usually range from totally bad and suck to don't suck too much. And there's a lot of stuff in here where it's drawing on secondary literature. And then there'll be like a bibliography, right? And that's where, like, if they're talking about virtue ethics, which these guys don't that much and tend to get wrong, they'll actually mention like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Read the Nicomachean Ethics. You want to check that stuff out, right? So, all right. Bruno, do I have any idea what Heideggerian ethics could be? Something with Sorge. Heidegger really resisted ethics. He thought that any sort of ethical comportment or way of looking at things was actually sort of putting blinders on. He makes that very clear in Being and Time. But you could develop an ethics of authenticity out of Heidegger. But you could do so with other existentialists, I think, as well. SV, do you recommend any documentaries for philosophy? I don't watch documentaries, so no. Let's see. Stephen Warren, is there any philosopher who stands out in your mind when it comes to the principles of self-discipline and control? No, there's a lot of philosophers who talk about those issues, so there's nobody who stands out. Epistemic mind, here's an interesting one. If you could meet any philosopher that has ever lived, who would it be and why? I'm a big fan of Anselm of Canterbury. He was a cool guy. Some people might not consider him a philosopher. Depends on how narrowly you construe philosophy. He's probably the person I've written the most about in the course of my career. Somebody who I really like as a person. I like his writings and thinking through them. And he appears to have been, from the stuff that people say, a really cool guy. And he lived through some extraordinary times dealing with those British kings, what a mess. So those Normans. All right, let's see, find some others that haven't been answered before. Let's see. Adam asks, could you please recommend the best book out there on courage? I don't know that there is a book specifically on courage that I would recommend. I would recommend that you read what ancient philosophers and medieval philosophers and modern philosophers have had to say about courage. I don't think you should try to just find one book about it. You want to compare the different ideas of it against each other. So John has a Jordan Peterson question. Is he some kind of pseudo-philosopher? Yeah, I'd say that's probably the best way to look at it. He's you could call him a philosopher if you want to, just the sort of same way as we call Ayn Rand a philosopher, third rate at best. Certainly has a lot of cultural influence because people love easy, solutions, and they love people who have these sweeping assertions about stuff and don't do careful research. But ultimately, whatever you're going to find that's useful in, Peterson just as much as you would in Rand, you can find with less baggage somewhere else. So, yeah. I think, years from now, he'll be as little read as Herbert Spencer is today, Uriah says top 3 works of aesthetic philosophy after Kant. I don't know. Hegel's Aesthetics, maybe. I'm not an aesthetics person, so I would someday like to actually do the research necessary to put together a class on aesthetics, since I teach at a institute, Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, but that's not really an area of specialization for me. Let's see here. Swapnil, I'm from India. Do you have any advice on reading Dostoevsky, undergraduate here? Yeah, Dostoevsky, I think that Mikhail Bakhtin is right in Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. Bakhtin is, by the way, somebody who, I said that, sometimes secondary literature turns into primary literature. Bakhtin is a prime example of that. He's really a cool person to read. He says that Dostoevsky is like Shakespeare, where none of the characters are by themselves representing Dostoevsky as such, but it's the interplay between the characters and their actions and their mindsets and their speeches that they give about their point of view that produces what we could call the Dostoevskian idea. So there's that part. That said, you're going to find a lot of philosophy being discussed within Dostoevsky in the mouth of characters. For example, just the other day, I was shooting stuff on Ivan Karamazov's speech prior to giving his Grand Inquisitor poem, his treatment of the problem of evil. That's not necessarily Dostoevsky himself speaking, but the characters put forth philosophical ideas, and they put it forth in the way that, say, like Platonic literature did, where their life also reflects these ideas. So that might be helpful. I don't know. John, are modern ontological arguments still considered effective arguments for the existence of God, do you think? I think the modern ontological arguments are mostly, uninteresting and kind of a waste of my time. I like Anselm's ontological argument, which actually runs through the whole of the Proslogion and wasn't called an ontological argument. And that's very different than what Plantinga is going to do with it, or even what Descartes or Spinoza did with it. It's not as if there's an ontological argument that all others fit into. It really depends on the way it's framed, and all this logically perfect, or this absolute perfect being or stuff like that. That's not what Anselm talked about. He actually told Ganillo, I'm not using this terminology for a reason. I'm using this terminology instead. So I don't know. Are they considered effective arguments? Depends on what you mean by effective. Do they convince people to believe in God? Not usually. Most people don't believe in God because of apologetics, because they read some argument somewhere and they're like, aha, now I believe in God. It's religious conversion and belief is usually a whole network of different things connected up with each other because we're complex people. Spinoza asks, why is it many people think science has superseded philosophy? Well, most of the people who believe that have a very dim, hazy conception of what science is and what philosophy is. And it's always easier to play around with abstractions and terms than it is to actually get messy and dig into things. The more that you come to look at science and the sciences and how they work, the more you see that philosophy is intrinsically connected with it. We can also add that there's people who are very smart in some respects, but are also kind of idiots in other respects, like Stephen Hawking writing his books, or Neil deGrasse Tyson, who, again, they have a very reduced understanding of what philosophy is, and they're kind of stupid in that respect because they should know better. And then they pronounce about how science has solved all these things. A lot of people doing neuroscience are doing a similar sort of thing. Oh, we solved the problem of free will. And then you read their stuff and you're like, no, you didn't. You don't have a clue about this stuff. You're just, you're really good at this thing over here, but you suck at everything else. And so there's my answer to why so many people think science has superseded philosophy. Puri, do I think that learning art, say drawing or composing music, is an ethically indifferent or unnecessary pursuit? I'm personally very drawn to art, but fear it might be just for me alone. That's one of the things you got to kind of figure out by doing. If you operate just on the basis of that fear, well, you just won't decide to do it, and you'll have regrets about doing your art. Try doing it and see what the experiment holds. I'm willing to bet that as you compare your art with others and you get involved with others and there's responses, you will find it's not just for you alone. Is it an ethically indifferent or unnecessary pursuit? Is it ethically indifferent? It can be, although, as McIntyre points out, most practices, when you actually get into them, you're going to find that there are some ethical dimensions to it. Unnecessary? I don't know. This is where you should read Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. If you look into yourself and you find that you must, in this case, write or produce art, then the answer is there for you. If you find out that you don't have to, then I guess it is unnecessary for you. But a lot of that is a matter of temperament. All right, Thomas Watson, thanks for response. Better than food. Cliff Sargent, who I believe you had a chat with a while back, has introduced me to so many good books. Good, that's great. Yeah, it's been a long time since I interacted with Cliff. I'm not sure how many years have passed. I know I was at least living here, but it's been a while. I think he's still out there, but I don't know if he's still doing book reviews or not. Let's see. Navaneeth says, how do you actively be in leisure according to Seneca and also put in work? How much work, thinking, rest, and leisure is needed for a good life? Okay, well, then you got to kind of figure out the balance, right? And it probably depends on where you are in life. Obviously, if you're an invalid, like Nietzsche was towards the end, of his writing time, where he had these terrible headaches and stuff like that, you can't get as much done. But I suppose you have to combine them. And part of it, here's what I'll say, part of it is not indulging in what we can call bullshit fake leisure. So, for example, just lying on the couch, binge watching Netflix all day long during your time off, that's not really leisure. It leaves you not feeling rested afterwards and able to go back to work and do things. Doing exercise might actually, in some respects, promote leisure better than just sitting around. So it really depends on what the leisure is going to produce or provide for you, I guess, All right. Couple questions here about aesthetics. Again, I don't have much to say about aesthetics. Zeno, what do you think of flowery prose? Do you like simple prose better? I mean, I don't think there's a choice between flowery and simple. I think there's a wide range of stuff in between, and I kind of like that. I do like to see rhetoric used effectively, and I can appreciate it for its own respect. I'm not interested in embellishment just for its own sake. And I got to say, I'm not a good reader of poetry, quite frankly. So, G. Gleiser, opinions on Arendt. Did you ever get into her? I got into her, and I've stayed into her. Arendt, I think, is one of the great 20th century philosophers. So I was really surprised to see when Trump got elected, the origins of totalitarianism going off the bookshelves, because that is a thick, dense book, the sort of stuff I like from Arendt, but is not everybody's taste, right? It's very complex. It's very demanding. And I think a lot of people bought it, read a little bit of it, and put it on their bookshelf. I think Arendt is actually a great thinker who is undervalued largely because of being a woman, because there is still, a need to bring to light women philosophers, in part because things have been so male dominated in weird ways. Rob McQueen, I'm planning on applying to graduate philosophy programs. I don't have a BA in philosophy and have been out of school for 8 years. Any suggestions on increasing my odds for acceptance? Yes, address that in your cover letter because it's definitely going to be an issue. They will probably want you, if you are accepted, to take some 400 level undergraduate classes in philosophy that they're not going to make other graduate students take. That was what they did when I was at Southern Illinois University. We'd have people with literature come in. In a lot of places, they want to see a writing sample. Try to do a writing sample that's pretty philosophical, I would say. So there's not much else. Try to score good on the GRE. One way that you can, in fact, try to do better on the GRE for places that are taking it. There'll be like these logic puzzle books that you can buy at supermarkets. Work your way through those, because that'll help boost your score on the GRE. A lot of it is kind of up to luck, unfortunately. All right. Let's see. Uriah Mark Todorov, do you prefer to write in the morning or read in the morning? I mean, I'd prefer to be able to do either one. Most mornings I'm doing other things like putting out fires or shooting videos, in part because of the light. We have these skylights and the light streams in. You can see a little bit of, where the thing is. So I can't shoot all day long, depending on whether it's sunny or cloudy. So mornings are good for that. Yeah. All right. Mark Hoofling. Do I think the structure of democracy has been irrevocably torn apart? Can we now be witnessing the decline of the United States as we now know? Well, I mean, anything is possible, right? I avoid huge sweeping statements like that myself because usually they have to be highly qualified. The United States has been in decline for quite a while if you're thinking about our political culture and about our economy, which is still one of the largest in the world, but is incredibly unjust and exploitative and unsustainable. And our situation in the world as this massive hyperpower, that's not going to continue on for that much longer. We've been spending way too much on our military in order to have that, and that's just not a particularly good investment. We're going to have to figure out how to live in a much more multipolar world than the one that we're currently living in. But I think it'll happen. And people are just going to have to get used to dealing with things that other countries have been dealing with for a while. Is the structure of democracy irrevocably torn apart? No. I mean, I'll say that when we're like living in an actual fascist regime, which is a possibility, rather than sort of a proto-fascist regime where the Trump administration really is right now. But it hasn't been radically torn apart. We still have, democracy at a variety of different levels. So, all right, Tumos Ansio, I know you're quite fond of Rilke. Who are some other poets you enjoy reading? Well, I just said I don't appreciate poetry the way that I sort of wish I would. So I don't really read much poetry. And part of that is not having the time to do it, unfortunately. I used to like reading, old French poetry, I used to read Baudelaire quite a bit, but I really haven't had much time. So, all right, we're getting close to the end. So I'm going to skip down a little bit. Paul says, "What's on your shirt? Looks D&D or metal related." Saxon, the band, right? This is somebody sent me this for my birthday. From the list that I had for my birthday bash, denim and leather is sort of like, the prototypical heavy metal uniform, you could say. And Saxon actually has a song called Denim and Leather and an album called Denim and Leather. So, all right. All right, I'm just going to grab a couple things, sort of do like a lightning round, you could say. I'm going to just look down and see what's the most recent stuff. RZZ, do you think Ayn Rand is misunderstood? She seems to be hated on many university circles, especially philosophy students. Yeah, she's misunderstood, and mostly because she's often not read by philosophy people, although I've actually known people in philosophy departments who were Randians. But once you do understand her, you see that she's not very good. So it's kind of, it's one of those sort of things. You don't understand me. Oh, you got to get to know me. And then you get to know me and you're like, yeah, you're a terrible person. I don't want to hang out with you. So, yeah. Let's see here. What are my thoughts on Jung? Do religious images hold the great importance as Jung claims? Religious images do have great importance. I don't think that Jung, I'm not a big fan of Jung when it comes to his sort of system or approach or stuff like that. I do enjoy reading him because he's a good stylist. Here's a good question from Jordan. Trump just tweeted that he wants to ban critical race theory. Will this have any implications for aspiring philosophers? Only if they think that Trump matters at all. I mean, he's an idiot and doesn't know what he's writing about most of the time. I mean, so he tweets something, not a big deal unless he actually enacts some sort of policy. He's tweeting to his base who hate critical race theory, even though none of them have actually done any reading in it or studied it. They just, like listen to people on the right, like, Shapiro and decrying it. And, it's basically a dog whistle for them. All right. Paul says Kierkegaard is fundamentally a provincial psychological study in anxiety, depression, and religious preoccupation. Why is he still read? Because you're wrong about that. You could say that he is that and yet more. So I invite you to find out the more by rereading and by thinking about it and approaching it in a different way. Got a couple minutes left. EB, do I believe Adorno is relevant today? Not only are his readings of Kant and Hegel thorough and underread, they're the source of his reading on utopia and non-identity. Adorno is really, really tough reading. I find him very rewarding, but he's as tough to read as Hegel is in many of his works. He makes you think so much about stuff. He's not directly applicable a lot of the time, but insights that he'll provide you with will help out. So he's worth reading. I've always found him very difficult to do any writing about or to teach. So yeah. Let's see here. Mr. Dharam Paji, can you give me some advice on pursuing the life of an academic? I've finished my master's from India in sociology. Want to apply to a PhD in the United States. This is a terrible time to try to become an academic in many fields, not only because, COVID has made so many things uncertain, but the job market was terrible before COVID started. It has been pretty bad and getting worse for the last 20 years, pretty much the entire time since I've been, working on my dissertation. So, I mean, if you want to try it, go ahead. People are going to get jobs, but you got to realize that if you're coming here to the United States, the majority of the positions that are being offered are for adjuncts. No benefits, fairly low pay, no job security. So, it's kind of up to you whether you want to try to do that. Do I have any advice on pursuing the life of an academic? Expect it to be hard. I mean, I'm in a very different kind of position because I have my own business, and then I have been teaching so long and I'm a known quantity that I get more work thrown at me than I can actually successfully do. That is the opposite of most academics. Most academics, one of the places that I teach currently, they fired 15 tenured professors over the summer in July just by closing their programs and saying, we don't have any need for you anymore. So that gives you an idea about the sort of stuff that's going on. It's a tough time. If you're going to be an academic, probably need to have some sort of side gig or exit strategy handy, I would say. And that's the reality we're in. So here's a good question. Leo, next, I'll close on this. I keep hearing bad things about prospects in academia. Is there any chance prospects could get better in the next decade? What would be needed to cause this? We would have to have a fundamental change about our priorities. Is that likely to happen? Is that likely to pervade itself into the more than 2,000 different higher educational institutions, each of which is its own little universe that we have here in the United States? Odds are kind of low, aren't they? That's not to say that things aren't, maybe better in other places, England or Scandinavia or France or, I'm only talking about American academia, but that's the way it is. Tristan says, just be the best. You're not going to be the best. There'll always be somebody who went to the right school and kissed up to the right person and knows these contacts, and they'll get the job, and probably the best person won't. JB Bell says, I'd say about as likely as universal basic income. At least in the United States, yeah. I mean, the universal basic income could be enacted on a federal level. You're not going to change American education on a federal level. It would have to change through all these institutions, and so it's probably not going to happen. So maybe you want to look at teaching in other countries and see what prospects are in Europe or things like that. So, all right. So that's a good thing to close on. Actually, let me close on this one. Is there a song or an artist you love but are afraid to admit it? I'm a metalhead who likes WAP by Cardi B, for instance. So I'm a metalhead. You can tell just by looking at this. And I'm also a big Duran Duran fan, and have been since I was quite young. I remember actually when I was in graduate school, this person who was living in our dorm coming in and looking at my stacks of CDs, and she was like, "You like that stuff?" And like her attitude about me changed at that point, because I think she thought that I was only into like metal and grunge and the heavy stuff. I mean, I was just talking the other day about how Rio is a really wonderful song. I don't think you would expect that of the heavy metal philosopher, but there it is. Some other artists who you might be surprised I really like: Liz Phair, John Cougar Mellencamp before he went nuts, New Model Army, although they're pretty hard edge, right? PJ Harvey, I mean, I could do a thing about this someday. People who you'd be surprised that I really like. I even like, some soft rock stuff, like real soft rock, like Christopher Cross, or Seals and Croft. My dad was a big fan of them. And I like, bands like Blood, Sweat, and Tears and things along those lines. So, so those are some things that I really enjoy. There's some really soft songs. I'm trying to like calling them to mind. I like Seals and Croft, Summer Breeze, right? I actually play that sometimes. So that's a good thing to end on. Glad all of you could join me for another AMA. I didn't get to everybody's questions as usual, but it would be impossible. They'd keep piling up. It's that sort of dilemma of the grains of rice on the chess board, right? So hope all of you have a great month, and keep studying philosophy, and try to enjoy yourself. Remember that the good that you're doing is still good, even if it doesn't change the world in any sort of radical ways.